It is late August 1944. The Third United States Army is a phantom, a steel ghost tearing through the heart of France. In less than a month, General George S. Patton's tanks have blitzed their way from the hedgerows of Normandy almost to the German border, covering hundreds of miles, bypassing strong points, and encircling entire German armies. The advance is so fast, so audacious, that maps at headquarters are obsolete by the time they're printed. At the front, the mood is euphoric. GIs are being showered with flowers, wine, and kisses in every village they liberate. It feels like the war is almost over. Patton himself, a figure of ivory-handled pistols and profane poetry, is at the peak of his powers, a whirlwind of constant, relentless motion. To him, the only thing that matters is the forward advance. To stop is to die. But miles behind this triumphant spearhead, in a stuffy, lamplit tent at a rear headquarters, a very different kind of war is being fought. There are no medals here, no cheering crowds. Just a handful of anonymous officers in the Army's Quartermaster Corps, men Patton derisively calls bean counters. And one of them, a colonel we'll call Carter, is staring at a series of numbers on a grease pencil board with a growing sense of dread. The numbers are simple. They represent gallons of gasoline, tons of ammunition, and pallets of K-rations. But what they are telling him is a story of impending doom. He looks at the daily consumption rate of the Third Army, the unquenchable thirst of thousands of Sherman tanks, trucks, and half-tracks. Then, he looks at the numbers representing the daily supply deliveries, arriving from the beaches of Normandy, hundreds of miles to the west. And the math doesn't work. The two lines on his graph are about to cross. According to his calculations, this magnificent, all-conquering army, the pride of the Allied forces, is on the verge of running out of everything. Not in a month, not in a week, but in a matter of days. He is witnessing a paradox that military planners have feared for centuries. The faster you advance, the longer your supply line gets, and the more fragile it becomes. Patton's glorious blitzkrieg isn't just defeating the Germans, it's strangling itself. This is the story of how the most celebrated American offensive of the Second World War was brought to its knees, not by German panzers or anti-tank guns, but by a simple, brutal formula on a logistician's chalkboard. It's the story of how an invisible war, fought with trucks and jerry cans, became more important than the war of bullets and steel. It's the story of the Red Ball Express. To understand the crisis of August 1944, we have to go back to the hell of the Normandy hedgerows. After the D-Day landings in June, the Allied advance had bogged down in a bloody stalemate. The bocage country of Normandy, a patchwork of small fields separated by ancient, thick hedgerows, was a defender's paradise. German machine gun teams and anti-tank guns were hidden in every tree line, turning every field into a killing ground. For 7 weeks, the American, British, and Canadian armies bled for every yard of ground they gained. It was a brutal, infantry-centric meat grinder, and Allied morale was beginning to fray. The High Command, desperate for a breakthrough, devised a plan codenamed Operation Cobra. The concept was simple: pure, overwhelming force. On July 25th, nearly 2,500 Allied bombers carpet-bombed a narrow, 4-mile-long corridor of the German lines near the town of St. Lo. They dropped so many explosives that the earth shook for miles, and German soldiers who survived were left shell-shocked and incoherent. Into this smoking, cratered gap, the U.S. First Army poured its armored divisions. The punch worked. The German line, stretched thin and battered by weeks of fighting, simply shattered. And this was the moment that George S. Patton and his newly activated Third Army had been waiting for. On August 1st, the Third Army was officially unleashed. Patton's orders were simple: drive through the gap, hook south, and then turn east, getting behind what was left of the German army in Normandy and encircling it. This was the kind of warfare Patton was born for, a war of movement, exploitation, and audacity. His armored columns, led by the legendary 4th and 6th Armored Divisions, did not just advance. They exploded across the French countryside. They bypassed pockets of German resistance, leaving them for the infantry to mop up later. They drove day and night, their tanks and half-tracks rumbling down poplar-lined roads in a seemingly endless river of steel. The success was breathtaking. The Third Army captured the key city of Avranches, securing the gateway to Brittany, and then pivoted east in a great sweeping maneuver. They were closing a trap on the German 7th Army, a maneuver that would become known as the Falaise Pocket. In the first 2 weeks of August, they advanced over 150 miles, capturing tens of thousands of prisoners and destroying hundreds of enemy tanks. The German retreat turned into a rout. It seemed like nothing could stop them. They were a force of nature, an armored hurricane. But a hurricane needs fuel to sustain its power. And with every mile they advanced, Patton's divisions were stretching their logistical tether to the breaking point. The very speed of their success was planting the seeds of their own failure. They were, quite literally, outrunning their supplies. You cannot tell the story of the race across France without understanding the man who was leading it. General George S. Patton, Jr. He was, and remains, one of the most brilliant and controversial commanders in American history. A swaggering, profane, deeply religious aristocrat, he was a throwback to an earlier age of cavalrymen and warriors. He believed in reincarnation, writing poetry, and, above all else, in the relentless, forward-moving attack. His philosophy of war was brutally simple. Hold them by the nose and kick them in the pants. He believed that an army's momentum was its most precious asset. To halt, to dig in, to be cautious, these were cardinal sins. To Patton, a static front line was a funeral pyre. This philosophy made him the perfect general for the breakout from Normandy. While other commanders might have been more methodical, Patton understood the fleeting nature of opportunity. He pushed his divisions to the absolute limit of their physical and mechanical endurance, demanding that they bypass resistance and drive deep into the enemy's rear, creating chaos and panic. His GIs both feared and revered him. He could be a tyrant, famously slapping soldiers suffering from shell shock, but he was also frequently at the very front lines, his pearl-handled revolvers glinting, directing traffic and urging his men forward. They called him Old Blood and Guts, and the nickname was perfect. He demanded their guts, and he was willing to spill his own blood to achieve victory. But this single-minded focus on combat came with a massive blind spot: logistics. Patton had an almost pathological disdain for the men and the machinery of supply. In his mind, the quartermasters, the engineers, and the ordnance officers in the rear were just obstacles, timid bureaucrats who didn't understand the vital importance of speed. He once famously remarked that his logisticians were the most pessimistic people in the world. They are always trying to get me to stop. He believed that a sufficiently motivated army could overcome any supply shortage. He famously told his staff, "Gentlemen, the officer who doesn't know his communications and supply as well as his tactics is totally useless." But in his heart, he saw supply not as a partner to tactics, but as its servant, something to be bullied and browbeaten into compliance. He wanted what he wanted, when he wanted it, and the how was someone else's problem. This clash of personalities and philosophies was at the heart of the coming crisis. Patton, the warrior poet at the tip of the spear, was demanding more speed, more attack, more forward momentum. Behind him, the logisticians, the men he despised, were looking at their numbers and realizing that the spear was about to break. Not because the enemy was too strong, but because the arm throwing it was about to run out of energy. The unstoppable force was about to meet the immovable object of mathematical reality. To grasp the scale of the logistical nightmare, you have to understand that a mid-20th century armored army is not just a collection of soldiers. It is a vast, fuel-guzzling, steel-devouring organism with a ferocious metabolism. The Third Army in August of 1944 consisted of over 250,000 men and tens of thousands of vehicles. And every single part of this giant machine needed to be fed, fueled, and armed every single day. Let's start with the headline item: gasoline. The workhorse of Patton's army was the M4 Sherman tank. A Sherman got, on a good day, on a paved road, about 0.7 of a mile per gallon, off-road in combat conditions that plummeted. Each of Patton's armored divisions had over 200 tanks, plus hundreds of armored cars, half-tracks, self-propelled artillery, and supply trucks. A single armored division could burn through 100,000 gallons of gasoline on a day of heavy fighting and movement. The entire Third Army needed, on average, between 300,000 and 400,000 gallons of fuel every single day just to maintain its operations. That's the equivalent of the daily gasoline consumption of a small American city, and it had to be delivered to a constantly moving target, hundreds of miles from its source. Then, there was ammunition. During heavy combat, a single infantry division could expend over 600 tons of ammunition in a day. That includes everything from rifle cartridges and hand grenades to massive 155mm artillery shells, each weighing nearly 100 pounds. Every bullet, every shell, every mortar round fired at the enemy had to be manufactured in a factory in America, shipped 3,000 miles across an ocean infested with U-boats, unloaded onto a beach in France, and then trucked to the specific artillery battery or machine gun nest that needed it. And finally, there was everything else. The everything else category, known in military jargon as sundries, was a logistical monster in its own right. It included food for the soldiers, millions of K rations and C rations. It included medical supplies, from bandages to blood plasma. It included replacement parts for every vehicle, tank treads, truck engines, radio tubes. It included engineering equipment, spare uniforms, cigarettes, and even mail from home. The official estimate was that each soldier in the field required the delivery of approximately 22 pounds of supplies per day to keep him in the fight. For the Third Army, this meant that quartermasters had to deliver over 5.5 million pounds, or 2,750 tons of material, every single day, just to keep the army from slowly grinding to a halt. This was the insatiable beast that the logisticians had to feed. And in August of 1944, the beast was moving further and further away from its food source with every passing hour. The problem wasn't just the Army's ravenous appetite. It was the fact that the entire system for feeding it was broken. And ironically, the Allies had broken it themselves. Before the D-Day landings, the Allied air forces had spent months systematically destroying the transportation infrastructure of northern France. This was a critical part of the invasion plan, known as the Transportation Plan. The goal was to prevent the Germans from being able to rush reinforcements to Normandy once the landings began. Allied bombers relentlessly attacked railway marshalling yards, blew up key bridges over the Seine and Loire rivers, and shot up any train they could find. The plan worked perfectly. It created a railway desert around the invasion area, isolating the German defenders and preventing them from mounting a rapid, decisive counterattack. The German 7th Army in Normandy was left to wither on the vine, unable to get the fuel, ammunition, and replacement tanks it desperately needed. But now, in August, this brilliant strategic success had become a massive logistical own goal. The Allies had inherited the very wasteland they had created. The French national railway system, one of the most advanced in the world, was a smoldering wreck. Its major bridges were down, its rail yards were cratered, and much of its rolling stock had been destroyed. The railways, which were supposed to be the arteries carrying supplies from the coast to the front, were completely severed. The situation at the ports was even worse. The only major deep-water port the Allies had managed to capture was Cherbourg. But the Germans, in their retreat, had carried out one of the most thorough and ingenious demolition jobs of the entire war. They had blown up the quays, sunk ships in the main channels to block them, and peppered the harbor with thousands of sophisticated mines, including acoustic and magnetic mines that were incredibly difficult to sweep. It would take months of dangerous, painstaking work by Allied engineers and Navy divers to get the port of Cherbourg even partially operational. This meant that virtually every single gallon of fuel, every bullet, and every K-ration had to be brought ashore the old-fashioned way, over the open beaches of Normandy. Supplies were unloaded from ships onto smaller landing craft, which then ran themselves up onto Utah and Omaha beaches, the same beaches where the infantry had fought and died just weeks before. From there, everything had to be loaded onto trucks. The entire supply effort for an army of over 2 million men was dependent on a handful of battered beaches and a crippled road network. It was an improvised, inefficient, and utterly unsustainable system. As Patton's tanks raced further and further east, the distance from these beaches grew, and the turnaround time for each supply truck got longer and longer. The logistical tether was being stretched to its absolute limit, and it was about to snap. The crisis didn't announce itself in a single dramatic moment. It began as a series of small, worrying reports from the front, like the first tremors before an earthquake. It started with individual units, spearheading the advance, suddenly running dry. A tank platoon commander in the 4th Armored Division, having just outflanked a German position, would radio back to his company headquarters. "We've secured the objective, but we can't move. We're out of gas." At first, these were isolated incidents, dealt with by ad hoc solutions. A few jerry cans would be scrounged from a supply truck, or a half-track would be dispatched to siphon fuel from a knocked-out vehicle. But soon, the incidents became more frequent, the shortages more severe. It wasn't just a platoon, it was a whole company. Then it was a battalion. Commanders at the front, men who lived and breathed Patton's philosophy of constant attack, were forced to make agonizing decisions. They would reach a critical river crossing or a key crossroads, with the German defenders in full retreat, and have to order their columns to halt, not because of enemy fire, but because their fuel gauges were on empty. They would sit there, fuming and helpless, watching a golden opportunity to trap more of the enemy slip through their fingers, all while waiting for the fuel trucks that were stuck in a traffic jam 100 miles behind them. Patton himself began to sense the problem. His daily briefings with his staff became increasingly focused on one single, infuriating question. "Where in the hell is the gasoline?" He would rage at his G4, his chief logistics officer, Colonel Walter J. Muller. He couldn't comprehend how an army as powerful as his could be stopped by something as mundane as a fuel shortage. In his mind, it was a failure of will, not a failure of physics. He suspected his rivals, particularly the British General Montgomery, of deliberately conspiring to steal his fuel to slow him down. He sent increasingly angry messages back to the rear echelons, demanding, pleading, and threatening to get more fuel. In one famous incident, he ordered his staff to create a forward-thinking intelligence unit he called the 3rd Army G5. When asked what the 5 stood for, he reputedly snarled, "For gasoline." The anecdotes from the GIs on the ground tell the story best. They began referring to their tanks not as Shermans, but as gasoline-powered pillboxes. They developed a black humor about the situation. A popular joke was that the 3rd Army's new shoulder patch should be a gas pump with a line through it. They were the fastest army in the world, an army that could go anywhere and beat anyone. But they were being forced to fight a new enemy, the empty fuel tank. The tremors were getting stronger. The earthquake was coming. While Patton was fuming at the front, the men responsible for solving the crisis were headquartered far to the rear, in a world of maps, charts, and endless columns of figures. This was the communication zone, or COMZ, the vast logistical and administrative organization that was, in effect, the service provider for the entire Allied Expeditionary Force. Its commander was Lieutenant General John C.H. Lee, a spit-and-polish, deeply religious engineer officer who was the polar opposite of George Patton. Where Patton was impulsive and aggressive, Lee was methodical and meticulous. And he was now in charge of the largest and most complex logistical operation in the history of warfare. COMZ's responsibility was immense. It controlled the ports, the supply depots, the transportation networks, the engineering battalions, the medical services, everything that happened behind the front line. Lee's job was to take the millions of tons of supplies arriving from the United States and Britain and deliver them to the combat armies. He was, in essence, the CEO of a massive, multinational corporation whose only product was victory. His command was a sprawling bureaucracy, and it was often criticized for being slow and inefficient. But it was also filled with some of the brightest logistical minds the Army had, men who understood that modern warfare was a science of numbers. These were the officers who, in late August, began to sound the alarm. They weren't operating on gut feelings or angry reports from the front. They were operating on cold, hard data. They knew the exact carrying capacity of a 2.5-ton GMC truck. They knew the average round-trip time from the beaches to Patton's forward supply dumps. They knew the daily consumption rates for fuel and ammunition for every division in the field. And they put all this data together. The picture that emerged was terrifying. The demand from the combat armies, particularly Patton's fast-moving Third Army, was exponentially outstripping the supply system's capacity. The system wasn't just strained, it was on the verge of total collapse. Lee and his staff at COMZ were caught in an impossible situation. On one hand, they had the Supreme Allied Commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, and aggressive frontline generals like Patton, demanding that they push supplies forward faster to sustain the breakout. On the other hand, they were bound by the physical constraints of a wrecked transportation system and a finite number of trucks. They couldn't create more roads or magically repair bridges overnight. This was the fundamental conflict, the tactical desire for speed versus the logistical reality of capacity. It was a war within a war, fought not with tanks, but with loading manifests and transportation schedules. And General Lee knew that if he and his bean counters didn't find a radical new solution, and find it fast, Patton's glorious advance would not just slow down, it would stop dead in its tracks, with catastrophic consequences for the entire Allied campaign in Europe. The formula that predicted the disaster wasn't some arcane piece of higher mathematics. It was a brutal, simple equation, based on a concept that became the obsession of every logistician in France: the ton-mile. A ton-mile is the metric for moving 1 ton of supplies 1 mile. It is the fundamental unit of work in military logistics. The problem facing the planners at COMZ could be expressed as a simple, terrifying equation. On one side of the equation, you had the demand. This was calculated by taking the number of divisions in the field, let's say 20 divisions for this example, and multiplying it by the daily tonnage requirement per division, which was about 650 tons. So, 20 divisions times 650 tons equals 13,000 tons of supplies needed every single day. That was the target they had to hit. On the other side of the equation, you had the capacity. This was far more complex. It was the number of available trucks multiplied by their average load, about 2.5 tons for a standard GMC truck, and then, critically, divided by the time it took for each truck to make a round trip. And this was where the formula broke down. In the early days after D-Day, When the front line was only 20 miles from the beaches, a truck could make several round trips in a single day. But now, with Patton's army over 300 miles inland, the equation changed dramatically. The round trip from Omaha Beach to the Third Army's forward depots now took a minimum of 3 to 4 days, and sometimes longer due to road congestion and breakdowns. So, the logisticians plugged in the numbers. They had a finite fleet of trucks. Each truck could carry a finite load, and the distance was constantly increasing, which meant the number of deliveries each truck could make per week was plummeting. The result was a massive and growing deficit. They were delivering only a fraction of the 13,000 tons needed each day. The rest of the Army's needs were being met by depleting the forward supply dumps that had been painstakingly built up. Those dumps were now almost empty. The men with the grease pencils could see the trend line with terrifying clarity. They could plot on a calendar the exact day, somewhere around the last week of August, when the forward depots would be completely dry and the Army's daily consumption would officially exceed daily deliveries. At that point, the advance would have to stop. It wasn't a possibility. It was a mathematical certainty. This cold, numerical analysis was a bombshell. It transformed the problem from a series of annoying, isolated shortages into a full-blown strategic crisis. It provided the irrefutable evidence that General Lee and his staff needed to go to the Supreme Commander, Eisenhower, and deliver the bad news. The current strategy was not sustainable. It didn't matter how brilliant Patton was or how bravely his soldiers fought. They could not defy the laws of physics and the brutal arithmetic of the ton-mile. The Army needed a miracle. And that miracle would come in the form of a radical, desperate, and unprecedented logistical gamble. Faced with the mathematical certainty of a total logistical collapse, the planners at COMZ came up with a solution that was as audacious as Patton's advance itself. It was born of desperation and genius. If they couldn't get more trucks or repair the railways in time, they would have to completely revolutionize the way they used the trucks they had. The plan was codenamed the Red Ball Express, a name borrowed from an old railway term for priority freight. The concept was simple in theory, but mind-bogglingly complex in practice. They would create a massive, one-way, non-stop conveyor belt of trucks, running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, from the supply depots near the Normandy beaches to a series of forward logistics hubs near the front line. To make this work, they had to impose an unprecedented level of control over the French road network. 2 main highways leading from St. Lo towards the front were designated as Red Ball routes. They were completely closed to all civilian traffic. Even more radically, they were turned into one-way loops. One road was for outbound, fully loaded trucks heading to the front only. The other was for empty trucks returning to the beaches only. This eliminated the bottlenecks caused by two-way traffic on narrow French roads. Military police were stationed at every intersection to ensure that nothing, no general staff car, no medical convoy, no other military traffic, was allowed to interfere with the flow of the Red Ball trucks. The trucks themselves were to be driven non-stop. A convoy would leave the depots in Normandy and drive until it reached a designated regulating station, where new drivers would take over, allowing the trucks to keep moving while the original drivers rested. The goal was to keep the wheels of every single truck turning as many hours a day as possible. Maintenance and refueling points were set up along the routes, operating like high-speed pit stops. Everything was geared towards one single purpose: maximizing the number of ton-miles delivered to the front each day. The scale of the operation was staggering. It officially began on August 25, 1944. On its first day, 67 truck companies, comprising thousands of vehicles, moved over 6,000 tons of supplies. At its peak in late September, the Red Ball Express would be operating nearly 6,000 trucks, carrying over 12,000 tons of supplies to the front every single day. It was a logistical Hail Mary, an attempt to build a mobile pipeline of gasoline and ammunition stretching across an entire country. It was an admission that the existing system had failed, and it was a massive gamble. The entire success of the Allied campaign in France now rested on the shoulders of the men who would drive these trucks down hundreds of miles of dusty, dangerous roads. The Red Ball Express was a mechanical marvel, but it was powered by human beings. And the vast majority of the soldiers who climbed into the cabs of those GMC 2.5-ton trucks were men who had been largely overlooked by the army they were now tasked with saving: African American soldiers. In the segregated U.S. Army of 1944, African American troops were overwhelmingly assigned to service and supply units, not combat roles. They were cooks, bakers, stevedores, and truck drivers in the Quartermaster and Transportation Corps. It was a racist system that deemed them unfit for combat, but suitable for manual labor. But now, in the crisis of August, these segregated units were suddenly thrust into the most critical role of the entire campaign. Approximately 75% of the Red Ball Express drivers were African American. They were the lifeblood of the operation. The conditions they faced were appalling. Many of these soldiers had been given only rudimentary driver training back in the States. Now, they were being asked to drive heavy, overloaded trucks for hundreds of miles on unfamiliar, war-torn roads. They were given little more than a map, a destination, and an order to keep them rolling. The shifts were inhuman. Drivers were expected to stay behind the wheel for 20, sometimes 30 hours straight, with only short breaks for food and coffee. They fought off exhaustion by singing, talking to themselves, and taking Benzedrine tablets, or pep pills, issued by the medics. They drove through rain and darkness, on roads with no streetlights, their headlights dimmed to narrow slits to avoid attracting the attention of German aircraft. The danger was constant. Though the front line was miles away, the routes were not entirely safe. German pockets of resistance that had been bypassed by Patton's advance still lurked in the forests. Snipers would take pot shots at the truck cabs. The Luftwaffe, though greatly weakened, could still mount nuisance raids, strafing the long, tempting columns of trucks. Accidents, caused by driver fatigue and mechanical failure, were common. And through it all, these men persevered. They developed a fierce pride in their mission. They knew that Patton and his tankers were getting the headlines, but they also knew that without them, the tanks would be nothing more than 3-ton steel statues. They gave their trucks names like Stompin' Stepper and Harlem Express. They were motivated by patriotism, a desire to prove their worth in a system that constantly undervalued them, and a simple, professional determination to get the job done. These unsung heroes, driving through a fog of exhaustion and prejudice, became the saviors of the Third Army. They were the true engine of the Allied advance. To ride the Red Ball Express was to experience a unique, surreal slice of the Second World War. It was a world unto itself, a 600-mile-long, 24-hour-a-day factory on wheels. A driver's journey would begin in the chaos of the supply dumps near Cherbourg or Omaha Beach. These were vast, sprawling fields of materiel, mountains of jerry cans filled with gasoline, pyramids of wooden ammunition crates, and endless pallets of K-rations. Stevedores, working under harsh floodlights at night, would load the trucks, piling them high, often well beyond their official 2.5-ton capacity. Once loaded, the trucks would form up into convoys. A convoy commander in a jeep would give a quick briefing, and then they would roll out onto the highway, marked with the distinctive red ball symbol that guaranteed them priority. The roads themselves were a testament to the sheer power of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. They were often little more than rural French farm roads, which were being pounded into dust by the constant traffic of heavy trucks. Engineers worked around the clock, grading the surfaces, reinforcing flimsy bridges, and filling in bomb craters. They put up thousands of signs in English, indicating speed limits, directions, and the famous motto of the express, "Keep 'em rolling." The one-way loop system was strictly enforced. A driver heading east toward the front would see an endless stream of empty trucks heading west on the parallel road, their drivers giving a wave or a thumbs up. Military police, often on motorcycles, patrolled the route, ticketing speeders. The limit was 25 miles per hour, though often ignored, and dealing with the constant stream of breakdowns. Mechanical failures were the great enemy. Tires blew out, engines overheated, and transmissions failed under the strain. Ordnance maintenance crews set up mobile workshops along the route, working frantically to repair disabled vehicles and get them back on the road. A truck that couldn't be fixed quickly was simply pushed into a ditch to keep the convoy moving. Life for the driver was a monotonous cycle of driving, caffeine, and gasoline fumes. They drove in 5-truck serials, maintaining a 60-yard interval between vehicles to minimize damage from air attack. They ate their cold K-rations in the cab. Sleep was a luxury, snatched in a few hours at a regulating station before they were assigned another truck to take back to the beaches. But through the dust and exhaustion, they saw the French countryside unfold, the scenes of recent, brutal combat giving way to liberated towns, where cheering civilians would line the roads, offering flowers or a bottle of Calvados. They were seeing the direct results of their labor, and it gave them a profound sense of purpose. This was the raw, unglamorous reality of logistics, a noisy, dirty, and utterly vital river of trucks that connected the industrial might of America to the fist of its armies. The logistical crisis in the American sector did not exist in a vacuum. It was part of a much larger and far more contentious strategic debate at the very highest levels of the Allied command. The central figures in this debate were George Patton and his great rival, the British Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery. Monty, the commander of the 21st Army Group, was Patton's temperamental opposite. He was cautious, meticulous, and methodical. He believed in amassing overwhelming force, careful planning, and fighting set-piece battles. Where Patton was a gambler, Montgomery was a chess player. In late August, as Patton's Third Army was blazing across central France, Montgomery's armies in the north were also achieving great success, liberating Brussels and the crucial port city of Antwerp. Now, with the German army in disarray, both commanders saw an opportunity to strike a single, decisive blow to end the war. But they had completely different ideas about how to do it. Patton was convinced that if he was given absolute priority for all available supplies, particularly gasoline, he could punch his Third Army straight through the weakened German defenses, cross the Rhine River, and drive into the industrial heart of Germany, the Saarland. He argued for a single-thrust strategy, a deep, narrow penetration that he believed could end the war by Christmas. Montgomery, on the other hand, argued for a similar single thrust, but he, of course, believed that he should be the one to lead it. His plan, which would eventually become Operation Market Garden, was to use his forces to seize a series of bridges in the Netherlands, outflank the main German defensive line, the Siegfried Line, and drive into the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland. This put the Supreme Allied Commander, Dwight D. Eisenhower, in an impossible position. The Allied supply system was so stretched that it could not possibly support both offensives at the same time. The math was simple. There wasn't enough gasoline to go around. Eisenhower had to choose. He had to decide which of his prima donna generals to back. This was not just a military decision. It was a political one. Sidelining the famous American General Patton in favor of the British Monty would be hugely unpopular in the United States. But favoring Patton over the senior British commander could strain the Anglo-American alliance. The debate raged in the halls of SHAF headquarters. It was a clash of egos, nationalities, and competing military philosophies. And the ultimate arbiter of this grand strategic argument was not a general or a politician, but the humble quartermaster. The decision of where the next great Allied offensive would take place would come down to a simple question: who was going to get the gas? The choice facing Dwight D. Eisenhower was perhaps the most difficult of his career as Supreme Commander. On one side, he had Patton, promising a spectacular, war-winning victory if only he were unleashed. The single thrust on a narrow front was a high-risk, high-reward gamble. If it worked, it could shorten the war by months and save hundreds of thousands of lives. If it failed, if Patton's spearhead was cut off and destroyed, it would be a disaster of epic proportions. On the other side, he had Montgomery proposing a similarly bold thrust in the north. But Eisenhower also had to consider his own deeply held strategic philosophy. He was, by nature, a cautious and collaborative leader. He instinctively favored a broad front strategy. This meant that all the Allied armies, American, British, Canadian, and French, should advance together on a continuous front, from the North Sea to the Swiss border. This approach was less spectacular, but it was also less risky. It would prevent the Germans from concentrating their reserves to crush a single, narrow penetration. It was a strategy of grinding the enemy down rather than knocking them out with a single punch. The supply crisis forced his hand. He simply did not have the logistical capacity to support a broad front advance and a major single thrust. For a few tense days, he leaned towards backing Patton, secretly telling him to take the Saar. But the sheer precariousness of the supply situation, with the Red Ball Express already strained to its limit, made him pull back from the brink. Ultimately, Eisenhower made a decision that was a classic compromise, and one that satisfied nobody. He would stick to his broad front strategy, but he would give logistical priority to Montgomery's northern thrust. The reasoning was strategic. The most important objective for the Allies was to capture a major, functioning deep-water port. The port of Antwerp, recently captured by the British, was the prize. But it was useless as long as the Germans controlled the Scheldt estuary, the 50-mile-long waterway that connected Antwerp to the sea. Opening Antwerp was the key to solving the entire supply crisis. Therefore, Montgomery's operations in the north, which were aimed at clearing the approaches to Antwerp and then launching Operation Market Garden, were given top priority. The decision was made. The gasoline, ammunition, and supplies that had been flowing to Patton's Third Army would be dramatically reduced. The lion's share would be diverted north to the 21st Army Group. Eisenhower knew Patton would be incandescent with rage. But the decision was final. The great American breakout, the historic race across France, was about to be deliberately and officially choked off. The bean counters had won. The news hit Patton's headquarters like a physical blow. The Third Army, which had been advancing at a breathtaking pace, was being put on a strict fuel diet. Its daily allocation of gasoline was slashed from over 300,000 gallons to a mere 25,000 gallons, barely enough for local defensive maneuvers, let alone a major offensive. Patton was apoplectic. He felt betrayed by Eisenhower, convinced that his rival Montgomery had conspired with the timid staff officers at Chef to sabotage his success. He wrote in his diary, "Ike is the best general the British have." In a famous, and likely apocryphal story, Patton gathered his staff and declared, "My men can eat their belts, but my tanks have got to have gas." The order to halt was the most difficult he ever had to give. All across the front, from Nancy to the Moselle River, the armored columns of the Third Army, which had been poised to break through the last German defenses west of the Rhine, began to slow down, sputter, and stop. It was a surreal and frustrating sight. Tank crews, who had been fighting and driving for weeks on end, now found themselves sitting in their vehicles in quiet French fields, waiting. They cleaned their weapons, performed maintenance on their tanks, and wrote letters home. But mostly, they just waited for the fuel that never came. The effect on morale was devastating. These were soldiers who had come to believe they were invincible, part of a lightning-fast army that could not be stopped. Now, they were stationary targets, forced to sit and watch as the enemy, who had been on the verge of total collapse, was given a precious, unearned gift: time. Patton, refusing to accept the halt completely, resorted to desperate and unconventional measures to get fuel. He ordered his ordnance units to convert any vehicle they could find, including tanks, into makeshift fuel tankers to bring gasoline forward. His staff organized unofficial, clandestine supply runs, essentially hijacking fuel from other units. There's a famous story of Third Army quartermasters disguising themselves as soldiers from the U.S. First Army, driving into their supply depots and making off with thousands of gallons of gasoline using forged paperwork. It was called Patton's secret pipeline. But these were just drops in a bucket. They could not overcome the massive, systematic diversion of resources to the north. The great engine of the Third Army, which had run on a mixture of high-octane gasoline and pure audacity, was now running on fumes. The momentum was gone. And on the other side of the hill, the enemy was starting to recover. The city of Metz stands at a strategic crossroads in the Lorraine region of France, guarding the gateway to Germany's Saar industrial basin. It is a city built for defense, a fortress protected by the Moselle and Saale rivers, and surrounded by a ring of powerful 19th-century forts built by the Germans after the Franco-Prussian War. These forts, with their thick stone walls, deep moats, and interlocking fields of fire, were considered obsolete in an age of air power and blitzkrieg. But in early September 1944, they were about to get a new lease on life. When the lead elements of Patton's XX Corps, part of the Third Army, reached the outskirts of Metz, they were expecting to find a demoralized and disorganized enemy. They were right. The German defenders were a hodgepodge of second-rate units, service troops, and officer cadets from a nearby training school. A swift, determined attack could likely have captured the city and its crucial bridgeheads over the Moselle in a matter of hours. The American spearheads were poised to strike. And then the order came down: halt. The tanks of the 7th Armored Division, some of which were literally within sight of the spires of Metz Cathedral, sputtered to a stop. They were out of gas. This halt, which lasted for several critical days, was a godsend for the Germans. It was a reprieve they could scarcely believe. It gave them the breathing room they desperately needed to turn Metz from a vulnerable city into a formidable fortress. The German High Command, realizing the unexpected opportunity, rushed reinforcements to the area. They brought in veteran Panzer Grenadier units, heavy artillery, and, most importantly, a new, determined commander who knew the city well. The obsolete forts were rearmed and re-garrisoned. German engineers laid new minefields and set up anti-tank positions. The citizens of Metz were conscripted to dig trenches and string barbed wire. In the space of just a few days, while Patton's army sat immobilized and fuming, the Germans transformed Metz into one of the strongest points on their new Western Front. When the Third Army finally received enough fuel to resume its offensive, it was facing a completely different situation. The window of opportunity had slammed shut. The battle for Metz would not be the swift, easy victory it should have been. Instead, it would turn into a 3-month-long, brutal, and bloody siege. It became a meat grinder, a battle of attrition fought in freezing rain and mud, with American GIs having to assault the formidable forts one by one. The halt before Metz, forced by the empty fuel tanks, stands as one of the great what-ifs of the campaign. It was a direct and tragic consequence of the logistical crisis, a perfect example of how a lack of gasoline could be more devastating than an enemy army. On the German side of the lines in late August 1944, the situation was one of unmitigated catastrophe. The German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army had been annihilated in the Falaise pocket. The survivors were in a panicked, full-scale retreat across France, abandoning their heavy equipment and trying to get back to the relative safety of the German border. The front had ceased to exist. There were huge gaps in the German lines, and Patton's armored columns were pouring through them at will. For the German High Command, it was a nightmare. Field Marshal Walter Model, a ruthless Nazi loyalist and a master of defensive warfare, had been brought in to stabilize the front, but even he seemed powerless to stop the Allied tide. German soldiers were demoralized, exhausted, and running out of fuel and ammunition themselves. They felt they were being chased by a relentless, unstoppable machine. And then, in the first week of September, the unthinkable happened. The machine stopped. German reconnaissance pilots, forward observers, and retreating soldiers all began sending back the same, scarcely believable reports. The American armored columns, the ones that had been driving 50 miles a day, were no longer moving. They were parked in fields and along roadsides, their crews casually performing maintenance. At first, German commanders were deeply suspicious. They assumed it was a trick, a pause to regroup before the next great onslaught. They braced for an attack that never came. It took them several days to realize that this was not a tactical pause. It was a genuine halt. For the Germans, it was nothing short of a miracle. They called it the miracle of Lorraine. This unexpected gift of time was the single most important factor in allowing them to avoid a complete collapse on the Western Front. It allowed Field Marshal Model to do what he did best: improvise, organize, and build a new defensive line. He used the time to rush every available man to the front. Fresh divisions from Germany, battered units retreating from France, even fortress battalions composed of older men and convalescing soldiers. They were ordered to dig in along the natural defensive barriers of the Moselle River and the Vosges Mountains. The new line was thin, and the troops were of mixed quality, but it was a line. It was a front. The halt allowed the Germans to rearm and re-equip their shattered panzer divisions. They brought up powerful anti-tank guns, including the dreaded 88mm cannon, and positioned them to cover the key river crossings and road junctions that Patton's army would have to attack. The city of Metz was transformed from a logistical hub into a fortress. This miraculous reprieve had a huge psychological effect on the German soldier. Just days before, they had felt utterly defeated. Now, with a new defensive line to hold and the enemy seemingly stalled, their morale began to recover. They had been given a second chance. The halt of the Third Army did more than just stop an advance. It allowed the German army in the West to reconstitute itself. It ensured that the war would not end in 1944. The battle would now be carried to the borders of Germany itself, and it would be a bloody, hard-fought struggle all the way to Berlin. All because of a fuel shortage. As the fuel crisis reached its peak, the logisticians of the communication zone were forced to get even more creative and more desperate. The Red Ball Express was a heroic effort, but it still wasn't enough. They needed to find new ways to get the most critical supplies, gasoline and ammunition, to the front lines, even at the expense of everything else. This led to the adoption of two extreme measures: air supply and a ruthless prioritization system known as combat loading. The most dramatic solution was to create a flying pipeline. The Army Air Force's Troop Carrier Command was called in to help. Their fleet of C-47 Skytrain transport planes, the same aircraft that had dropped the paratroopers on D-Day, were converted into makeshift fuel tankers. 5-gallon jerry cans of gasoline were loaded by the hundreds into the fuselages of the planes. The C-47s would then fly from airfields in Britain or newly captured strips in Normandy directly to forward airfields near Patton's front line. These forward fields were often little more than hastily cleared pastures, sometimes still within range of German artillery. The planes would land, and soldiers would form human chains to unload the thousands of jerry cans as quickly as possible, often while the plane's engines were still running. The C-47 would then take off immediately for another run. It was a dangerous, inefficient, and incredibly expensive way to move gasoline. But for a few critical days, the C-47s were the only thing keeping the tanks of the Third Army from running completely dry. On the ground, the logisticians implemented a brutal triage system. They began to combat load the trucks of the Red Ball Express. This meant that only items deemed absolutely essential for immediate combat operations were loaded. The top priorities were gasoline, ammunition, especially artillery shells, and just enough K rations to prevent starvation. Everything else was left behind. Medical supplies, spare parts, engineering equipment, winter clothing, mail from home, all of it was shoved aside to make room for more fuel. This had serious consequences. It meant that a tank crew at the front might get enough gas to move a few miles, but if their tank broke down, the spare parts needed to fix it were sitting in a depot 300 miles away. An infantry unit might have plenty of bullets, but they were running low on bandages and had not received a hot meal or a letter from home in weeks. This ruthless focus on the essentials kept the Army fighting, but it came at a high cost to the Army's overall health, morale, and long-term sustainability. It was the logistical equivalent of a doctor keeping a patient's heart beating but ignoring all their other injuries. These desperate measures, the airlifts and the combat loading, showed just how close to the edge the entire Allied supply system was. They were battlefield expedients, not long-term solutions. They were plugging the holes in a dam that was about to burst. The halt of Patton's Third Army in front of Metz and the Moselle River in early September had a cost that can be measured in more than just miles on a map or days on a calendar. It had a profound human cost, paid in the blood of American soldiers. The battle that followed was a brutal lesson in the consequences of lost momentum. Had the Third Army been able to continue its advance without stopping, it likely would have crossed the Moselle against scattered and disorganized resistance. But the week-long pause changed everything. When the attack was finally renewed, the GIs of the 5th and 90th Infantry Divisions faced a well-prepared, determined enemy dug into strong defensive positions. The crossing of the Moselle River became a horrific ordeal. American engineers tried to build pontoon bridges under a constant, murderous barrage of German artillery and mortar fire. Assault boats carrying the first waves of infantry were ripped apart by machine gun fire from the far bank. The river, a potential stepping stone to victory just days earlier, had become a deadly obstacle. Once across the river, the fighting for the forts surrounding Metz began. This was a type of warfare for which the American Army was ill-prepared. It was a throwback to the siege warfare of World War I. The GIs had to attack formidable stone fortresses with concrete walls several feet thick. American artillery shells often bounced harmlessly off the fortifications. The fighting devolved into a grim, close-quarters affair. Small units of infantry had to creep forward under heavy fire, using explosives and flamethrowers to attack individual pillboxes and gun emplacements. The casualties were horrific. Divisions that had been fighting for weeks in the fluid battles across France now saw their ranks decimated in a matter of days for a few hundred yards of ground. The weather turned against them, with constant cold rain turning the battlefields into a sea of mud, adding trench foot and exposure to the miseries of combat. The fighting for Metz dragged on through September, October, and into November. It became one of the bloodiest and most protracted battles fought by the U.S. Army on the Western Front. The city was eventually captured, but the cost was staggering. The Third Army suffered over 40,000 casualties in the Lorraine campaign. Many of these losses can be directly attributed to the halt in September. The fuel crisis didn't just stop an army. It got soldiers killed. It handed the tactical advantage back to a reeling enemy and forced American GIs to pay the butcher's bill to get it back. It was a stark reminder that in warfare, logistics, and lives are inextricably linked. While Patton's army sat fuming and idle, the supplies that had been diverted from them were fueling a massive operation in the north. The gasoline, ammunition, and transport priority given to Montgomery's 21st Army Group were all in service of one of the most ambitious and daring Allied plans of the war, Operation Market Garden. The operation, which began on September 17th, was Montgomery's bold gamble to end the war by Christmas. The market part of the plan was a massive airborne assault, the largest in history. 3 entire Allied airborne divisions, the U.S. 101st and 82nd, and the British 1st, were to be dropped deep behind enemy lines in the Netherlands. Their mission was to seize a series of key bridges over the Maas, Waal, and lower Rhine rivers. The Garden part was a powerful ground offensive by the British XXX Corps. They were to advance up a single narrow road, linking up with the airborne divisions at each bridge in a lightning thrust that would take them 64 miles in just 2 days. If it succeeded, the Allies would have outflanked the Siegfried Line, crossed the Rhine, and be poised to drive into the industrial heart of Germany. The entire operation was a huge logistical undertaking, and it was only possible because of the supplies that were not going to Patton. The hundreds of C-47 transport planes needed for the airborne drop, the massive artillery preparations, and, most importantly, the tens of thousands of gallons of gasoline required for the British armored columns. All of it came at the expense of the other Allied armies. This was the strategic trade-off that Eisenhower had been forced to make. In essence, he had taken a gamble. He had halted Patton's proven, successful advance in Lorraine in order to back Montgomery's unproven, high-risk plan in the Netherlands. For a few days, it seemed like the gamble might pay off. The ground forces made good progress initially, and most of the bridges were captured intact. But the plan was too ambitious, the timeline too optimistic. The ground advance was slowed by German resistance, and the British paratroopers at the final bridge, in the city of Arnhem, found themselves facing 2 elite SS Panzer divisions that Allied intelligence had failed to detect. The battle for the bridge too far, at Arnhem, became a heroic but tragic disaster. The British 1st Airborne Division was virtually wiped out. Operation Market Garden had failed to achieve its strategic objective of crossing the Rhine. It was a costly defeat, and it left a bitter taste. The supplies diverted from Patton had not won the war. Instead, they had fueled a glorious failure, while Patton's army remained stalled in the mud of Lorraine, fighting a battle that might never have happened if they had just been given the gas. The great logistical decision of September 1944 had pleased no one and had arguably prolonged the war. By November 1944, the logistical situation for the Allies was beginning to change. The Red Ball Express, which had been the lifeline of the armies for over 2.5 months, had served its heroic purpose, but it was an inefficient and unsustainable solution. The real answer to the supply crisis lay with the ports and the railways. After a brutal and costly battle, Canadian forces finally cleared the German defenders from the Scheldt estuary in early November. On November 28th, the first Allied supply convoy sailed into the magnificent, undamaged port of Antwerp. It was a game-changer. Antwerp could handle more tonnage in a single day than the Normandy beaches could in a week. With the opening of Antwerp and the slow but steady repair of the French and Belgian railway networks by the Army's engineers, the pressure on the truck companies began to ease. On November 16, 1944, the Red Ball Express was officially terminated. In its 81 days of continuous operation, it had achieved a logistical miracle. Its nearly 6,000 trucks had traveled a combined total of millions of miles and delivered over 500,000 tons of supplies. It had staved off a complete collapse of the Allied advance and had enabled the armies to continue fighting, albeit at a reduced pace. But the human and mechanical cost had been enormous. The drivers were suffering from profound combat exhaustion. The trucks themselves were worn out, many of them driven to the point of destruction. The end of the Red Ball Express was not a grand ceremony. It was a quiet, weary winding down. The red ball signs came down from the highways, and two-way traffic was restored. For the drivers, it was a chance for some long overdue rest, a hot meal, and their first real sleep in months. The legacy of the Red Ball Express is complex. It was not a perfect solution. It was a desperate improvisation, a massive band-aid on a gaping logistical wound. It did not provide enough supplies to allow Patton to win the war in 1944. But what it did do was prevent a catastrophic defeat. It kept the armies in the field. It moved just enough fuel and just enough ammunition to allow the Allies to liberate France and reach the borders of Germany. It was a symbol of America's industrial might and the incredible endurance of its soldiers. The quiet heroes of the Express, the African-American drivers who had been deemed unfit for combat, had proven to be among the most valuable soldiers in the entire theater of operations. They had kept the wheels of victory turning, one exhausting, dusty mile at a time. The halt of the Third Army in September 1944 has become one of the great what-if debates of the Second World War. For decades, historians, military analysts, and Patton's own devoted acolytes have argued over a tantalizing question. If Patton had been given the supplies he demanded, could he have ended the war in 1944? The argument in favor is compelling. In late August and early September, the German army in the West was, by all accounts, a broken force. It was in a state of chaotic retreat, with no continuous defensive line. German morale was at rock bottom. Patton argued that the Siegfried Line, Germany's vaunted border defense, was at that time manned by little more than old men and boys. A powerful, determined armored thrust, he believed, could have punched through it with relative ease. Once across the Rhine, the Third Army would have been in Germany's industrial heartland, with little to stop them from driving deep into the Reich. Proponents of this view argue that Eisenhower's decision to halt Patton and divert supplies to Montgomery was a catastrophic error, a failure of strategic vision that squandered the single best opportunity to win the war quickly. They point to the bloody battles of the autumn of 1944, the siege of Metz, the fight for the Hürtgen Forest, and the failure of Market Garden, as the direct, tragic consequence of this decision. Halting the advance, they argue, gave the Germans the one thing they needed most: a pause to regroup, rearm, and man their border defenses. This, in turn, led to the brutal winter fighting and the shocking German counteroffensive in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge. However, there is a powerful counterargument. Critics of the Patton could-have-won-the-war theory argue that it is a dramatic oversimplification. They contend that even if Patton had been given all the available fuel, his single armored spearhead would have been incredibly vulnerable. It would have had a long, exposed northern flank, which the Germans could have attacked from the north. His supply line, already stretched to the breaking point, would have become even longer and more tenuous. A single armored army, no matter how brilliant its commander, cannot conquer a nation by itself. These historians argue that Eisenhower's broad front strategy, while slower and less glamorous, was fundamentally sound. It was a strategy based on the reality of logistics, not on wishful thinking. They believe that even if Patton had crossed the Rhine, his advance would have inevitably culminated, bogged down by lack of supplies and German counterattacks, leaving his army dangerously exposed deep inside enemy territory. We can never know for sure what might have happened. The debate is fueled by the powerful, larger-than-life personality of Patton himself. But the controversy highlights the central theme of the campaign: the eternal tension between bold tactical opportunity and the cold, hard constraints of logistics. The Great Supply Crisis of 1944 was a traumatic but invaluable learning experience for the United States Army. It was a brutal, real-world seminar in the primacy of logistics in modern, mechanized warfare. The lessons learned in the dusty fields of France fundamentally reshaped American military doctrine and laid the groundwork for the logistical systems that have sustained its forces ever since. The most important lesson was a simple one. Logistics is not a supporting function. It is a co-equal partner with strategy and tactics. Before 1944, many combat commanders, like Patton, viewed the Supply Corps as a subservient organization, a sort of military delivery service. The crisis proved that this mindset was dangerously flawed. An army without fuel and ammunition is not an army. The logisticians, the bean counters, earned a new level of respect and influence in military planning. From then on, no major operational plan would be approved without a thorough and realistic logistical annex. The concept of the tooth-to-tail ratio became a central focus of military planners. This is the ratio of combat troops, the tooth, to support and logistics personnel, the tail. The campaign in France demonstrated that for every rifleman or tanker at the front, you needed a small army of truck drivers, mechanics, engineers, clerks, and quartermasters to keep him supplied. The American Army learned that it needed a much larger and more robust tail to support its powerful tooth. The experience also spurred technological and organizational innovation. The Army invested heavily in developing better transport vehicles, more efficient methods for cargo handling, and new systems for tracking supplies. They developed the concept of just-in-time logistics, aiming to deliver supplies to the front exactly when they were needed, rather than building up huge, vulnerable depots. The use of air transport for critical supplies, a desperate improvisation in 1944, became a standard part of the logistical toolkit. Most importantly, the crisis of 1944 created a generation of logistically minded officers. Leaders like Eisenhower, who had to wrestle with the problem at the highest level, carried that experience with them. When Eisenhower later became president, his understanding of the importance of transportation infrastructure was a key factor in his push for the creation of the interstate highway system in the United States, which he justified, in part, as a national defense measure. The Red Ball Express and the frantic scramble for fuel were not just a chapter in the history of a single campaign. They were a wake-up call that forced the U.S. military to recognize that in the 20th century, amateurs talk about tactics, but professionals talk about logistics. The story of the Red Ball Express is more than just a story about trucks and supplies. It is a pivotal chapter in the history of civil rights in America. The heroic, indispensable contribution of its predominantly African-American drivers shone a harsh light on the hypocrisy of fighting for freedom abroad while denying it to your own soldiers. These men were risking their lives to defeat a racist, fascist regime. Yet they were forced to serve in a segregated army, commanded by white officers, and were often subjected to racism and discrimination from the very soldiers they were supplying. They ate in separate mess halls, slept in segregated barracks, and were denied the opportunities for advancement that were open to their white counterparts. Despite this, they performed their duties with extraordinary professionalism and courage. Their performance on the Red Ball Express was undeniable proof of their skill, dedication, and patriotism. It systematically dismantled the racist arguments that had been used for decades to justify keeping African American soldiers out of meaningful military roles. They were not just laborers. They were warriors in their own right, fighting a different but equally essential kind of battle. The commanders on the ground noticed. Generals like Patton and Lee, while products of their time, could not ignore the evidence before their eyes. They saw that the African American transportation companies were among the most efficient and reliable units they had. They saw their incredible endurance and their fierce pride in their mission. The story of their achievement spread. Back in the United States, African American newspapers, celebrated the heroes of the Red Ball Express, using their story to agitate for greater civil rights and an end to segregation. The war created a powerful momentum for change. The glaring contradiction of a segregated military fighting a war for democracy became increasingly untenable. While the road to equality was still long and difficult, the Red Ball Express was a major milestone. The performance of its drivers, and that of other African American units like the Tuskegee Airmen, provided irrefutable evidence that segregation was not only morally wrong, but also militarily inefficient. Just 4 years after the end of the war, in 1948, President Harry S. Truman signed Executive Order 9981, officially desegregating the United States Armed Forces. This historic decision was not made in a vacuum. It was built on a foundation of sacrifice and excellence, demonstrated by men like the drivers of the Red Ball Express. They had done more than just deliver the goods. They had delivered a powerful blow against the forces of segregation, proving on the roads of France that a soldier's worth is measured by their courage and competence, not by the color of their skin. In the end, wars are not just stories of battles won and lost. They are stories of systems, of interlocking parts, of cause and effect. The Great Allied breakout across France in 1944 is often remembered as a story of brilliant generalship and the bravery of the common soldier. And it is that. But it is also a story about mathematics, about the cold, unforgiving formula of supply and demand. The ultimate lesson of that summer campaign is that in modern warfare, logistics is not just a part of the strategy. Logistics is the strategy. You can have the best tanks, the bravest soldiers, and the most audacious general in the world. But if you cannot get a gallon of gasoline from point A to point B, all of it is worthless. The formula that the quartermasters agonized over in their tents was more powerful than any weapon. It was a formula that dictated the pace of the advance, the choices of the generals, and ultimately, the fate of the soldiers on the front line. It proved that an army's reach cannot exceed its logistical grasp. The Red Ball Express was the heroic, improvised attempt to change that formula, to bend the laws of logistical physics through sheer human will and endurance. For a time, it worked. The drivers of the Express, the unsung heroes of the campaign, pushed themselves and their machines beyond all reasonable limits to keep the flame of the offensive from dying out completely. But in the end, they could not defy the math. The halt of Patton's Third Army was not a failure of courage or a failure of leadership at the front. It was a failure of a system that was overwhelmed by its own spectacular success. It serves as a timeless reminder that victory is not just seized on the battlefield. It is manufactured in factories, shipped across oceans, and most importantly delivered down dusty, dangerous roads by ordinary people doing an extraordinary job. The final formula for victory in the Second World War was not written in a general's operational plan. It was written on the manifests of supply trucks, in the logbooks of exhausted drivers, and in the columns of figures on a quartermaster's chalkboard. It was a formula written in oil and steel, sweat and blood.